My guest today is Dr. Breeda McGrath, Associate Campus Dean for Online Programs at Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She's a clinical psychologist and nationally certified school psychologist. Our topic today is school shooting. Hello and welcome, Dr. McGrath.
Lovely to meet you.
Dr. McGrath, just a month ago, on May 3rd, there was a first school shooting incident in Belgrade, Serbia, where I come from. The shooter, a 13-year-old male student, killed 9 of his classmates and a security guard, and injured 5 other students and a teacher. While this was the first school shooting in my home country, unfortunately, this kind of incidents are not news for us here in the United States. They may shock us, but they no longer surprise us. And that is why we're here today. I was hoping that we can search together for possible psychological explanation of school shooting events. Dr. McGrath, who is the typical American school shooter?
Well, unfortunately, there isn't a typical school shooter. There are lots of different types of people who engage in very violent acts like this. If there was a very simple answer, we would be able to say, oh, well, let's identify a person who's likely to do something so destructive and maybe prevent it in the future, right? We have a great tradition of research and a great field of psychology here in the US. We would have figured that out, right, if it was that simple. People are very complex psychologically, and the reasons why someone would do something so dramatically destructive, cruel, devastating, shocking, is really hard to understand. And so that's why we're searching for why people do it, what kinds of people would do this. It can be very difficult to also provide solid research for it because many people who have engaged in school shootings have also killed themselves. And so we have very little to go on in terms of why they would do such a thing. Was it planned? Was it premeditated? We have some of that information, but we don't have a lot of information or a lot of ability to research why people do what they do and how we could prevent it, make sure it doesn't happen again.
What drives most of them? What do these children and teenagers have in common?
So what they have in common is a desire to engage in something very destructive. Obviously, many of them have an experience of what we call existential angst or anguish. They feel a very strong rage and anger about the conditions of their existence. They're angry, most often they're angry at the world, and they take it out within the confines of where they can. They also have access to lethal weapons. You know, there are many children, there are many people in the world who feel extreme anger. There are many people who go through early childhood trauma that have led them to this very maladaptive coping strategy, right? Taking out your anger on other people by shooting them. That's a very maladaptive, unhealthy way of coping with anger. There are different ways of coping with anger. Understanding anger, having seen anger before, having been the victim of anger, having been assaulted, and then also your own psychological makeup, is an important part of that picture. So a person who engages in a school shooting has usually a complex makeup that is partly their own mental health, partly their own experiences developmentally up until that point. And then some of them have negative peer groups where they're feeding on each other and engaging in aggressive and violent action. For others, it's psychosis, it's mental illness. For others, it's that they've been victims of that and they have been trained to use weapons and they know how to use weapons and have access to them. Those are some of the reasons why. It's not all one type of person, unfortunately. There are multiple different types of people. It's not all mental illness. It seems to be mostly male, but it's not all the same kind of person. Many of the young people that we have seen engage in these kinds of destructive, violent acts seem to have experienced depression, hopelessness, disproportionate emotional responses to difficulty. They have a hard time developing empathy for other people. A number of them have, engagement in fantasy worlds around killing, but it's not all of them. It's not all due to video games. It's not all due to difficulty, in early childhood. Not all of them have been the victims of bullying, but many have. Many have experienced rejection from peers. Some of them have actually engaged in bullying and intimidation themselves. Many of them felt isolated. Many felt that they really were not part of kind of the mainstream.
So you mentioned the early trauma.
Yeah.
What would be that trauma that they could have that could prompt them later to do something like this?
For some, it could be, violence. They're the victims of physical, emotional, sexual abuse as children. That can lead to very unhealthy ways of coping with emotions as you get older. It impacts the way you understand yourself, the way you understand the world, what you anticipate in relationships. And so that's the issue for many of them. For some, it's actually, a rupture between them and, we'll say, the parenting. They don't have a strong sense of identity because they have a very weak attachment to their caregivers, to their parents, to the people who are raising them. And so when a child doesn't have a secure sense of home, really just love, it doesn't matter what the material conditions are, but if a child has a secure sense of home, it's easier for them to experience and express different kinds of emotions.
So role of parenting, you just mentioned the parenting. So what kind of parenting we can do to make sure that this doesn't happen? And what in children who attempt something like this, what was the role of the mother and what was the role of the father?
It's a very important and difficult question because we often look for causes and we look to blame, so that it won't happen again. And unfortunately, we can't, or fortunately for the parents, we can't point the finger and say it's the parents' fault. We're often looking for the evil source. Where does it come from? Because human development is so complex and because each person has their own developmental journey, there are aspects and roles that parents play that can influence the child. But they don't necessarily ever have full control over everything a child does. But things that a parent can do to prevent this type of situation are working with children early on to express themselves, to express their emotions, to problem solve when they're having a tantrum, to help them cope when they don't get their way, when they're not happy with the situation, when they fall out with their friends, when they're upset about what's going on in school, when they're being disciplined. The way in which parents communicate with children sets them up for how they cope with life, how they learn to express their anger, their frustration, their sadness, their loneliness, and then helping them develop social skills so that they can develop empathy for other people and connect with other people and learn that we're interdependent. And so that they can develop just emotional coping strategies and learn how to support other people. One of the most important pieces of it that's very delicate for parents to kind of manage is proximity, what I call proximity. You have to stay close to your children, even during the difficult times. And it's very hard for a parent to decide, okay, how many questions do I ask? What do I do with a teenager when they're saying, nothing happened at school today? No, there's no news to tell you. I have, parents have to probe and try and get close to their children so that they can understand what's going on.
How do you do that?
You keep bugging them. You keep a you keep a good distance, but a good closeness at the same time. You keep trying to connect, find out what they like, understand their moods without trying to be their best friend, but getting a sense of who they are and helping them to understand that we respect them. as well as being their parents, right? As well as telling them what to do and what, what the rules are in this house, there also has to be that sense of respect and admiration for their individuality. You're a person in your own right, and you have to ask questions.
Unpopular question, probably, that this will be for many of people. But if you suspect that something is going on and you try and they don't respond and you can't find out, but you are sure because you're a mother that something is going on, do you spy on them?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you do. It depends on how serious you think it is. You do it and you know that there are going to be consequences. There will be what we call a rupture. It will harm your relationship with them. It will harm their trust with you. You're already not trusting them, but depending on the level of seriousness that you are concerned about, you have to acknowledge when you have suspicions and then you were wrong. You have to acknowledge that and be able to talk with your child about that, confronting them with what you think, gently if you can, what you think is going on or what you're afraid of. Confronting a child and saying, I am worried that this is what I'm missing and that this is what you're doing. The closer you get to the truth, the more reactive they will be. If they get really mad and slam the door, then you're pretty close to what's going on. And knowing that the tempers have to simmer down, and knowing that you have to also be able to say, it's not just about discipline and authority. It's about being human and saying, I am worried about this. We just had this incident in the school. Here's what I'm concerned about. And helping to work together with children to say, it's not just about owning guns, right? It's not just about, I was just doing a little research on what are the cultures like in Belgrade, what it's like, how many people own guns, what kinds of access do you have to guns? It was so interesting to find out that yes, many people own guns for different reasons than why people own guns in the US. It was very interesting for historical reasons, because they're historical war artifacts and all of that kind of thing. But owning guns for self-defense is a different story. But if you have a child who feels isolated, feels depressed, is angry, is, skilled in the use of weapons, and when they get angry, tends to take it out on other people, you have a very worrying situation there. And so being able to tackle that, what do you do when you have a child who's sad? Being able to get into mental health and not stigmatize it and start providing services in schools and start really talking about it in the community and saying, so how do we deal with it? Are we really setting ourselves up for some danger or some difficulty? Do we have children who are isolated and feel like it's really has to be severe if you go to a counselor? How do people feel about that? And could we make that an easier thing to do? Could we provide more support everywhere?
Dr. McGrath, are there great parents in great parenting and still children who have problems with crime and violence?
Yes. Yes.
How do you explain that? Is that a peers influence? Do we blame schools? Do we blame teachers? How about school principals?
We, being human, we are looking for somebody to blame, to point the finger at. It's a natural thing that we have. And you know what? Even if we could blame one source, we still wouldn't be satisfied. We love accountability. We want to blame. The reality is freedom of choice, development, right? Children push boundaries, learn what's right and wrong on a trajectory. We're not born agreeing to our society's rules about what's right and what's wrong, what's ethical and what's not, what's moral in this culture and what's not. Those are things that we teach children and they test. That's a part of development. They test they start by telling maybe little lies, or they might steal a little piece of food or some money. And then they learn about trust and they learn about what they lose when they break a rule. And then they basically learn that by keeping the rules and agreeing to them and understanding them and realizing how much they benefit from maintaining the rules, that's the developmental trajectory along ethics. So it's not just the school environment. It's not just the parents and how they've raised the children. It's not just that there are bad children or evil people. It's multiple different things. Peer groups are definitely a source of potential issues. Peer groups can also be the best thing that ever happens to a child, right? So there are ingredients available in all of those circumstances, in all of those contexts. What we have to do is try and ensure that in each of those contexts, we're putting the best possible ingredients. So, are you watching who your children are hanging out with? Are they a positive peer influence for the most part? Yes, if they're teenagers, they are testing the limits. But are there some good, healthy, positive kids there? And how are some ways that you could help them steer them in the right direction? What about the school? Is the school a safe place? Does the school have a plan for preventing bullying? Not just discipline for when it happens, but actually preventing it, so that there are incentives for children to take care of one another, to report when there are issues, to really make school a happy place where everyone belongs.
How does school prevent bullying?
I'm going to send you a resource. There are multiple different ways. Really developing relationships between the children, providing opportunities for kids to see this is the culture of this school. This is how we behave towards one another. This is what is expected of you. And here are the incentives for behaving in positive ways, pro-social ways, we would call them, with one another. Ensuring that the teachers can see what's going on with the children so that there isn't a lot of unsupervised time, right? So that really children can be seen in the bathroom, during lunchtime, when they're out of class. Those are the unstructured times when bullying typically happens. Making sure that those times are monitored and that early on, children are confronted, reskilled, retooled when they start to show signs of rejection or bullying or difficulty in dealing with painful emotions, how they problem solve. Problem solving is one of the most difficult things to teach children, but it is one of the most important things to teach them. And then having really clear relationships with parents, really starting in early and showing this is the culture of the school. Here's what they're learning, and they're actually developing well. Because we want to, stay consistent with whatever strategies are working in schools. When the school is detached from the parents, that can be really difficult. It's very difficult for a child to feel like they can bring home whatever's going on in school because there's no relationship. There has to be a relationship there. And then having programming that helps parents in their job. Both parenting and teaching are really difficult jobs. And so being connected, being on the same page, and being able to say, wow, we're worried, we're seeing a trend of this, or we're seeing a trend of that among the kids. Let's work together to solve it. Because that's humanity. There's no perfect person. Nobody is perfect.
Dr. McGrath, you're in academia right now, but you're a nationally certified school psychologist. And let's just imagine the situation that you are in school and you're a psychologist over there, where it becomes known that there are certain students that are bullying other students or students.
Yes.
What will be your job? How would you approach to this problem? How would you try to solve this?
That's a great question. So I worked in schools as a school psychologist for many years, near Chicago, actually. And so the school, first of all, would have a system of referral. So the teacher would know, or should know, that first thing would be for the teacher to know, I see something, who do I talk to? Who do I refer this child to? If the teacher believes that it's something that the psychologist really could do with having an individual conversation with the child about, they literally can make a direct referral to the psychologist. Another strategy that can be used that I've worked on in specific schools is something called peer mediation. Peer mediation is a system when two kids are having difficulty, any teacher can refer them to the system, and it can actually be run mainly by students under the supervision of an adult, a teacher, or one of the administrators, or one of the people working in the school. And there's a process through which the two kids come together, discuss their differences, and agree to work out the conflict and reconcile afterwards. That's a marvelous system that works well in schools. Watching for what's causing the conflict or what's causing the bullying and contacting parents is an important piece of this picture. Contacting the parents of both children would be a thing that perhaps as a psychologist I would do, in addition to talking to the child and letting the child know, I'm going to talk to your parents. Sometimes I would ask, especially if it's a teenager, I would ask the teenager, how would you like me to explain this to your parents? Would you like to be on the phone with us? Would you like me to put them on speakerphone so that we can talk to them together? How are we going to resolve this? Now that you know me, I'm going to be checking in on you. And so making it an individual piece of the picture, but also understanding the context in which it happened. Is this something where the child is part of a group, where they feel like they need to show bravado, or they're being prompted by someone else to do it, they're trying to prove something? Or is it where they have perhaps a violent situation going on at home? You'll usually know right away when you see the parent's style of discipline and what they do. If the child tells you, if you call my parents, they will beat me when I go home,
then you know.
You clearly have to work on a different plan there and help explain to them there are different ways of working out your frustrations, your anger. And sometimes if you find through that a child who has some real anger issues, some difficulty in expressing anger appropriately, some depression, some hopelessness, that's something where a child needs to receive services on a more regular basis to figure out how can we help them develop the skills to be healthier.
Dr. McGrath, violence is giving birth to violence, obviously, but what does internet and social media nowadays give birth to in regards to children and the crimes that they can do?
Gosh, you have great questions, Ivana. One of the real issues with school shootings has been the fact that they're finding that school shooters have been watching, downloading, and following the actions of others. So there's what we sometimes call copycat activity, where we have seen, school shooters or people who have engaged in mass violence. They have gathered information about other deadly assaults, other very violent, assassinations and killings. And so the way in which we talk about this in the media, the way in which we, describe it, discuss it, what we put online, and how, we engage with kids to explain and understand it is really important. Unfortunately, we can't control everything that's out there, and this is the information age. I mean, people want to know the facts so that they can decide for themselves what's going on, what do I think about this, how do I judge these people, how do I judge these incidents, what do I need to do? It's very difficult to control all of that. But I think if we can lean into or really promote the importance of mental health support, if we can use these situations to really support funding for well-being, for mental health well-being everywhere, for suicide prevention, for understanding depression, understanding the importance of social development for children, understanding the importance of providing healthy activities for kids in every community, things for them to do, providing an understanding of how society looks at school shootings and what the consequences are, and how prison is not typically a great place for people to rehabilitate. What happens to school shooters who don't engage in suicide? Where are they? Do we hear about them after they have been caught and sentenced? Prisons are very challenging places to try and develop, rehabilitation programs. And there are some that have worked, but it's a very challenging thing to do. I mean, prison is not a great place, great environment for someone who's already having significant mental health issues or even has mental illness. It's a very difficult place for a person to recover and rehabilitate. So making sure that mental health is supported in the same way as physical health. You know, if I break my ankle, I'm pretty sure I'll get some, you know, reasonable healthcare to take care of that. But if as a person I feel like I'm experiencing depression, I'm having a hard time coping with a certain stage of life, something that's happened in my life, I'm not sure that health insurance is always going to take care of that. And it's seen in a very different way. If a person experiences diabetes, for example, they have expectations about how the healthcare system is going to help them live with that. It's not the same way with mental health. You know, there's a lot of shame associated with it. And I would love for it to be seen in the same way as any other health condition, because the potential for recovery is tremendous. Once you provide mental health support, once you make it part of the way we see things, and you introduce things like resilience as an important way in which we see people, developing strength, recovering. You know, if you don't get picked for a soccer team, you recover from that. You work on it, you get up and you try again. And that kind of resilience really applies to mental health. But it also has to be culturally consistent. You know, you can't use the same strategies that are used in the US in every other culture. You know, some of those don't work in Ireland, I'll tell you now. It has to be something that makes sense in my culture, in my family. It can't be something that doesn't make sense in the culture. And it is possible. And there are lots of resources available for something called school climate, school safety. There are lots of different kinds of research studies being done about how you can build a sense of belonging for children in their schools that helps them deal with the ups and downs of life. You know, creating trauma-sensitive schools, knowing that there's a lot of difficulty. I mean, you think about our histories, right? The history of violence in our countries is significant. And that, you know, filters through in our identities and how we respond to problems. And so being able to incorporate that into child development and the way we expect children to develop and the supports we think they might need that can help them grow, those are important.
So speaking of recovery, how do we help kids and teenagers who witness school shooting? We now in Belgrade have a lot of questions at this moment. Do we let these kids go back to the same classroom? Do we let these kids go back to the same school? Do they finish school year? How they go back to their schoolwork? And of course, what is the impact on their mental health and how do we deal with their trauma?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And it can only be answered within that particular context, right? In each of the schools where there has been a school shooting, the community comes together to try and figure out if it would just be re-traumatizing to have children back in the context where they know this dreadful thing happened. And so what some schools have done is that they have continued the school year to continue the routine. Right? Routine is very important for children. School is very important for children. What are they going to be doing if they're not in school? How are parents going to take care of them? And what are they going to do with them all day, every day if they're not in school? So getting back to the actual job of school is important. But in some circumstances, the communities have decided that it's really too traumatic to be in that building where those deaths happened. And so what they've done is they've worked either in another building or they've worked with other schools where they can be absorbed into another school where there is space. And that's a caring kind of act to say, we understand what happened. We're not pretending it didn't happen. We are going to help support you. And then making sure that you provide various different levels of support. Many children after a period of time will be able to recover from this traumatic event. If they have witnessed directly or even just heard it, there will be various different levels of trauma. And so you respond by providing support for those levels of trauma. Immediate support for those who are in distress. For everyone who's in distress, they all need support. Some children recover faster than others. That just is what it is. Sometimes it's based on their own emotional system. Sometimes it's based on what they have experienced in their lives. Sometimes it's based on their emotional and mental health anyway. what they have gone through in their own families, just providing whatever support is needed without judging what a child needs is really important, so that you can get them to a level of functioning that is healthy for them. You never go back to the way things were, because you can't ever forget something like that. But deciding how you're going to move forward, making sure that the school system has mental health supports for whenever someone needs it, watching and monitoring for those kids who might be at risk for emotional difficulty, at risk for following up and doing similar things themselves with their own anger, with their own depression, with their own despair. You know, making sure that you're watching carefully and providing avenues or opportunities for children for someone to ask them, and so how are you doing, more often than before, making it part of typical everyday for someone to say, how are you doing? You know, what do you think about it? Bringing it up in safe, controlled ways, so that it's not something that the children are focusing on all the time, and that there's a way to think about how we move forward, always talking about how we move forward. How do we get back to doing school? How do we move forward with this new identity? What are we going to do to make sure that we heal, focus on healing and focusing on our identity as a community that heals, rather than only our identity as a community that had this dreadful thing happen. Watching for their coping strategies and coping skills, continually bugging them about how they're doing, and then communicating all the time until they're sick of you asking.
Dr. McGrath, let's say you are a school psychologist in a school that just survived school shooting. I mean, that some kids are gone, the other kids are injured, and you're there.
Yes.
What would be your plan? What would you do?
We would do something like what you were telling me the school in Belgrade did. We would immediately call on our colleagues to get us an immediate increase in support right away, because it's an emergency situation. You bring in all the help you can find.
All the resources.
All the resources, all the personnel. The whole community must respond, because it is a massive emergency situation. It's not just in that moment, it is also for the recovery. And so you all come together, you develop a plan, and you identify all of the different levels of risk. What are the different levels of service that we can provide for the children who are in immediate distress, for the children who heard about it and are somewhat traumatized, but were not immediate witnesses to it, for the rest of the community, because it's part of your identity now. And then you design a plan together with all of the experts for the next 5 hours, the next 5 days, the next 5 weeks, the next 5 months, the year, and the next 5 years. You develop a plan that's sustainable. You revise it as needed, as new things happen, as situations change. You bring the parents in and you communicate all the time to say, you know, we got this piece right, and it looks like this part is going well. It looks like we didn't anticipate this other thing, so that you continually evaluate, how's the plan going? What's working well, what's not working well? You document, but plans like this have to be in the moment as well. You know, in some schools, what we've learned over the years in crisis prevention and training in schools is that you can have a great crisis committee and have a most marvelously designed plan that sits lovely in a folder and sits on the shelf and everyone knows that it's there. But unless every person you stop in the hallway knows what happens if there's an emergency in this building, then you don't really actually have a plan. When you walk down the hallway and you ask any teacher or any child, when you hear the fire alarm, what are you supposed to do? If you really have a plan for preventing things and you really have a response, every child will know what they're supposed to do when they hear a certain kind of alarm. In schools in the US, they also have a code system that they will announce over the intercom. We have a code yellow, or we have a code red. Every child, every teacher, every staff person, everyone needs to know exactly what they're supposed to do. And that happens. In many countries, there are drills for different kinds of emergency situations. And that's where you know you have a plan if every child knows what they're supposed to do because they're so tired of doing them, because they do them once every 2 months or whatever. And you develop those plans because things happen. What we say in the field of crisis prevention and intervention is, it's not if a crisis will happen in your school, it's when a crisis happens in your school, because there are different kinds of crises, right? If there's an accident on the street in front of the school, that's a crisis. It changes all the traffic, someone is hurt, they're probably related to the school. If there's a fire in the school, and there are different levels of crisis. So the crisis team has its little group that responds to whatever happens in the school, and then they update every year. What crises did we deal with this year? How was our plan? Did it work? Which parts worked really well? Which parts are we really not happy about? Who do we need to bring in who can help us? Because you don't have to do it by yourself. And you can there are school crisis teams in the US who will come and help, who will get on a call, who will, really share what we have learned so that you can decide which parts of that are useful for you. Some will be, some will not be, because culture is such an important piece of this picture.
Dr. McGrath, at the beginning of this interview, I said that school shootings are so often here in this country now that unfortunately they still shock us, but they no longer surprise us.
Yeah.
What does this say about all of us?
What does it say in Belgrade? It depends. I mean, my answer would be from me as a school psychologist who does, who has been involved with school crisis prevention for many years. I see children, I see adults, I train psychologists, I'm very concerned about a variety of different kinds of things. It says certain things to me based on how I see human beings and how I see society and how I see culture. It says that, for me anyway, and I'm interested to hear what you think it says, but I think it says that we are becoming accustomed to a higher level of violence, both structurally and culturally in our societies. And structural violence isn't always physical. It's often about inequity. It's often about poverty. It's often about the lack of support for health. And so sometimes I think structural violence causes or is really related to and connected to physical violence like this. And then our ability to tolerate it means that it's becoming part of our culture, which really worries me a great deal. And so it provokes me to think that we have to, increase our conversation about peace, about what it takes to build a community of peace, what it takes to build a culture of peace. And it takes starting with, the babies, and starting with how we talk to one another, how we solve problems, how we express our differences politically, how we communicate when we know we disagree with someone else, that we still communicate and keep going. So it tells me what we need to do in addition to where we are. And I'm interested to hear what you think about what it says.
It is my interest to ask questions today.
Maybe we'll carry on that conversation.
We'll carry on that conversation. Yeah. But while I was preparing for this interview, I saw a TED Talk with Aaron Stark, where he talks about how he was planning on doing a mass shooting. And the day before, he went over to his friend's house, and his friend's mom baked a pie. And he was sitting there eating that pie, talking to them. And it was then and there, this moment, when he decided not to proceed with his plans. And it was just something so powerful because it's all about the human connection.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, we talked a lot today about how to get closer to the children, how to communicate, how to make them feel secure and safe and not disconnected from home, from school. Do you believe that the good human connection can prevent crimes like this?
I do. I believe that it can. I will, put a caveat in there, though, that each individual who is engaged in these dreadful acts has their different motivations. And so if for one person, that warm human connection, that caring moment, it can change a person. You just don't know the impact of a small gesture, right? A small act of kindness. For some, it can. For some, it's not going to do it. But I would prefer to put the positive out there in the event that it might, rather than thinking, well, there's nothing I can do to change that person. Because we are always a work in progress, and every person is deciding every day what to do, what not to do. We are faced with so many choices. That's one of the challenges, one of the greatest challenges of being a human being is the number of choices you have in the day. And in your relationships, you decide in every act whether you're deciding for the relationship or just for yourself or for something else. And I think whatever we can do to influence a person positively, sometimes it's clear what the right thing is to do. Sometimes it's not. And because emotional states are very complicated and hard to really pinpoint, and it's rarely cause and effect. This caused that. We might as well continue, putting the positive out there, because we know that the lack of positive, caring relationships, the lack of nurturing, can cause tremendous difficulty for children. The adverse childhood experiences, the research on that is really clear. And that gives us the grounds to say, well, let's chip off and address as many of these as we can. Let's reduce the amount of violence that children are witnessing and experiencing. Let's address neglect through healthy social policies that support families. Let's make sure we pay attention when something happens to a child that could cause them great distress. Let's see the signs of early depression or anxiety or bullying and address them and prevent. And I think that's the way to go. Because the reality is that, if the security agencies were to be honest with us and tell us how many of these incidents they have prevented, we would really be shocked and more than a little worried, because there's a lot going on in terms of security in schools and in communities. And so I believe that, while the increase is very worrying, I think there's a lot going on to prevent it. And so the more we can lean into that, the stronger we can really make mental health supports in our communities and in our schools, the better off we will be.
Dr. McGrath, thank you so much for you being here for us today. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for clarifying so many issues and for your help with this very important subject.
It's my pleasure, Ivana. I really appreciate the amount of attention you're paying to it, the kinds of exploring questions that you're asking. I'm happy to be of any help that I can be, and I'm looking forward to following up with you.
Thank you, Dr. McGrath.